The moment the customer's voice cut through the store, it was like a whip cracking across a quiet room. Everyone froze. "You call this service? What a damn joke," the man barked, slamming his palm hard on the checkout counter. "It's not rocket science, just scan the damn items. Maybe if you weren't so slow, the line wouldn't be backed up all the way to the freezer section." The cashier, just a young woman barely holding herself together, flinched. The dark circles under her eyes told the story of sleepless nights, and now her trembling hands struggled to scan the last few items. Her breathing grew shallow, rapid. Behind those watery eyes was a mind on the edge, trying desperately to hold on amidst the pressure crushing her from all sides. Whispers began spreading down the line, murmurs of annoyance, some even joining in under their breath. Yet one man remained silent, watching. Benjamin Foster. No one knew who he really was. Dressed plainly in a standard store uniform, glasses perched on his nose, a cap pulled low to hide his graying hair, he looked like just another temp stock worker. But 5 years ago, Benjamin had bought this entire grocery chain, expanding it to 12 locations across the state. His vision had always been clear: build a business with kindness, where customer service came from respect, and where employees were treated like people, not cogs. But lately, things had slipped. The reports he received were full of excuses: staffing shortages, high customer volumes, new hires struggling to keep up, but none of it explained the sharp, steady decline in service and morale. And the most disturbing part? That nagging feeling in his gut that everything he'd built was being slowly, silently eroded beneath him. So he made a decision, one he never imagined he'd have to make. He went undercover. No more boardrooms, no more filtered updates through layers of middle management. Now, Benjamin was a temporary stock associate, blending in with the team. No one here had ever seen him in person, including the managers. It was the only way to see the raw truth for himself. The cashier looked down, voice shaking as she whispered, I'm sorry, sir. I'm trying my best." The customer curled his lip in contempt. Pathetic. And in that instant, like a lightning strike splitting through storm clouds, Benjamin stepped forward. "That's enough, sir." The man turned, irritated. "And who the hell are you? Another useless employee?" "Yes," Benjamin replied calmly, holding his ground. "But I'm not going to stand by while you talk to her like that." The customer scoffed. "So now you're gonna lecture me? If she knew how to do her job." "She is doing her job," Benjamin cut in, voice firm, eyes unwavering. "You're the one who's out of line." Tension snapped through the air like a taut wire. The customer's hands clenched at his sides. For a moment, it seemed like things might escalate further, but just then, the store manager finally arrived. Greg, middle-aged, heavy-lidded with fatigue, approached the scene without urgency. "All right, let's calm down," Greg muttered, barely looking at the cashier, who was now quietly wiping tears from her cheek with her sleeve. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't even look at her. And then, what broke Benjamin inside? Greg turned to the girl and said coldly, "Mia, get it together. You're holding up the line." Mia quickly nodded, eyes lowered in shame, and turned back to her register. Her hands still trembled, her spirit visibly dimmed. No words of support, no defense, just blame. Benjamin clenched his jaw so tight it ached, but he stayed in character. He couldn't blow his cover, not yet. But one thing was now blindingly clear. This wasn't just a one-off problem. There was something deeply broken in this store, and it wasn't the customers, it was the leadership. The rot was coming from the inside. He wouldn't leave until he understood exactly what had gone wrong and how to rebuild it from the ground up. For the rest of his shift, Benjamin kept his head down and his ears open. He observed everything. The hurried footsteps, the sighs that went unnoticed, the silence between overworked employees. They weren't just tired, they were disappearing, fading beneath the weight of endless expectations and zero recognition. He didn't see a disorganized store. He saw people whose spirits were being ground down. And that, to Benjamin, was the kind of failure he couldn't forgive. Shelves were partially stocked, inventory carts sat abandoned in aisles. Customers wandered aimlessly, looking for help that never came. The few workers who remained moved like ghosts, exhausted, invisible. Then came a moment that pierced through the noise. An elderly woman struggled to lift a case of bottled water into her cart. Her arms shook with effort. Benjamin began to step forward, but someone beat him to it. Mia. Despite everything she had endured just moments earlier, she approached gently. Her voice was soft, warm, still full of humanity. "Here, let me help you with that." She carefully lifted the case into the woman's cart. "Thank you, dear," the woman said, giving Mia's arm a grateful pat. Mia managed a small, tired smile, then she quietly returned to her station, shoulders sagging under the weight of a day that felt impossibly long. Benjamin watched her go. The stiffness in her gait, the way she rubbed her temples when she thought no one was looking. It told him more than any report ever could. It told him the system was broken, that leadership had failed, and now it was time to face that failure head-on. As the clock ticked toward the end of the day, the crowd inside the store grew heavier. The line at the checkout stretched almost to the back wall. Benjamin glanced toward the office and saw Greg, the store manager, standing nearby, arms crossed, simply watching. He didn't step in to help. He didn't issue directions. He just stood there with a vacant stare, as if everything unraveling in front of him had nothing to do with him. Benjamin kept up the role, continuing to stock shelves. Nearby, a young employee was restocking cans, mumbling to himself under his breath, "I can't do this anymore." His name tag read Reed Lewis. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, but the frustration in his voice echoed across the aisle. "Every shift feels like hell. We get yelled at, pushed past the limit, and no one cares." Standing beside him was Rachel, a woman in her late 20s. She sighed deeply. "I asked Greg if we could get more cashiers. He said corporate wouldn't approve it." Benjamin clenched his fist but kept his expression neutral. That was a lie. He had never rejected a single request for extra staffing or overtime. In fact, he encouraged it, if it meant keeping his employees from burning out. But this truth had clearly never reached him. Greg had never passed those requests up the chain. "I saw Mia crying in the break room last week," Reed whispered. "She didn't eat, just sat there, staring at the table like she wasn't even there." Rachel nodded, her voice tight. "She's working double shifts because Greg told her if she didn't, he'd have to cut her hours entirely, and she can't afford to lose even a single paycheck." A lump formed in Benjamin's throat. His employees, dedicated, hard-working people, were being manipulated, overworked, and pushed to the edge. Not by accident, but by design. Suddenly, a loud crash rang out. He turned toward the sound. A display of cereal boxes had toppled, spilling across the floor. A teenage employee stood frozen in the mess, his face pale with fear. A customer nearby was glaring at him with open disgust. Greg finally moved, but not to help. "How hard is it to stack boxes correctly?" he snapped. The teenager stammered. I was just trying to make room for—" "I don't want excuses." Greg cut him off sharply. "Clean it up, then go to the back. If you can't handle the basics, I don't want you out here." Benjamin stood still, seething. It wasn't Greg's words that shocked him. It was the cold, casual cruelty. His fury was bubbling beneath the surface, and it took everything in him not to blow his cover right there. But he couldn't act yet. Not until he had everything he needed. The right moment came at the end of the shift. As the last employees were clocking out, Benjamin headed straight to the office. The door was ajar. Inside, Greg sat slouched in his chair, eyes glued to his phone. The desk was bare. No paperwork, no schedules, no trace of real work being done. Benjamin stepped inside and quietly closed the door behind him. "If you need something, leave a note. I'm busy," Greg muttered without looking up. Benjamin set down his cap and glasses, his voice steady and low. "No, Greg, you're not busy." Greg looked up, frowning. Then his face faltered as recognition crept in. Who are you?" Benjamin leaned forward slightly, voice sharp as a blade. "I'm Benjamin Foster, the owner of this entire company." Greg gave a half laugh, trying to mask his unease. "Yeah, right. The owner wouldn't show up here." Benjamin said nothing. He simply pulled out his phone, opened his corporate email, and set it on the desk, his name and title displayed in bold. Greg's face drained of color. He froze. "You've been lying," Benjamin said. "I've been here for 2 days. I've seen it all. The short staffing, the mistreatment, the way you stand by while your team is harassed, exhausted, and humiliated." Greg opened his mouth to speak, but Benjamin didn't give him the chance. "I reviewed the system. Not once have you submitted a staffing request. Instead, you've been cutting hours to make your metrics look better. You hid behind their silence to cover up your failures." Greg's jaw tightened, trying to recover. "I did what I had to do. If I didn't push them, things would fall apart." Benjamin met his gaze, calm but absolute. "So you think fear and neglect are management strategies?" This time, Greg had no answer. "So what you call threatening and abandoning your employees' leadership?" The room fell into dead silence, and in that moment, everything was about to shift. "You don't get it," Greg growled, his fists clenched on the desk. "They're lazy. They complain no matter what. If I don't push them, they'll take advantage of the system." Benjamin drew in a long breath, shaking his head slowly. "You've got it completely backward, Greg. The only thing they're taking advantage of is each other's kindness, because they sure as hell aren't getting support from the one person who is supposed to lead them." He wasn't trying to insult Greg. He was holding up a mirror to a man who refused to see what he had become. But instead of reflection, Greg erupted, his frustration boiling over. "Oh, what now? You gonna fire me?" Benjamin stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, yes. Greg's eyes widened, disbelief flashing across his face. "You can't." "I can, and I am." Benjamin calmly pulled out his phone and sent a short message. "The HR will finalize your termination paperwork in the morning. Tonight, security will escort you out." Greg shot up from his seat, voice low and trembling with restrained rage. "You're making a huge mistake." Benjamin didn't flinch. His gaze was steady. "No, the mistake would be keeping you here one more day." Greg knew it was over. There were no more excuses. No one left to shield him. Without another word, he gathered his things, brushed past Benjamin, and slammed the door shut behind him. Silence returned to the room. Benjamin stood still for a moment, letting his heartbeat settle. One problem had been removed, but the real work, the repair of what Greg had broken, was just beginning. He stepped out of the office and walked toward the front of the store, where the remaining employees were finishing up their shift. None of them noticed him at first. That wasn't surprising. They had grown used to being overlooked by anyone in charge. Benjamin cleared his throat. "Everyone, may I have a moment?" Heads turned. Mia, Louis, Rachel, and several others. Their expressions were a mix of exhaustion and skepticism. "My name is Benjamin Foster," he began. "I'm the owner of this company. And as of tonight, Greg is no longer your store manager." A heavy silence blanketed the room. Then Lewis let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "Wait, what?" Benjamin folded his arms. His voice was firm but not unkind. "I've seen firsthand what's been happening here. The problems didn't start with you. They started with leadership. Leadership that should have protected you, supported you. Greg failed at that, and so did I, for trusting the wrong person." Mia's eyes widened slightly. The weariness on her face momentarily gave way to surprise. "I'm not here to make empty promises," Benjamin continued. "I'm here to make changes, starting tomorrow." He paused for just a beat, then said clearly, "Tomorrow we'll have a temporary manager in place while we search for a long-term fit. Staffing will be increased immediately. No more forced overtime, no more veiled threats, and no more passing the blame." Rachel crossed her arms, her gaze still cautious. "We've heard promises like that before." Benjamin nodded. "And you have every right to be doubtful. That's why I'm not asking you to believe me. At least, not yet. I'm asking you to watch what happens next." There were no cheers, no applause, and Benjamin didn't expect any. What he received instead was something more important. Eyes that met each other, not with hope, but with the quiet possibility of it. The next morning, Benjamin was at the store before it even opened. He had already contacted corporate to arrange for an interim manager and revised the staff schedules overnight. When the employees gathered in the break room, the air was still uncertain. Some stood with arms crossed. Others leaned against the walls, watching warily. Benjamin got straight to the point. "Starting today, things are changing." He introduced the temporary manager. Her name is Karen Mitchell. She's been with the company for 8 years and has successfully turned around 2 struggling stores. She'll be here shortly. But before that, I wanted to speak to you directly. Mia stood near the back, unreadable. Lewis shifted from foot to foot. Rachel's sharp gaze hadn't softened, but she didn't interrupt. "I reviewed the payroll records," Benjamin said. "Effective immediately, anyone who was forced to work overtime without proper pay will receive back pay." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Some employees blinked in disbelief. Lewis exhaled, as if he'd been carrying that weight on his shoulders for far too long. "I also reviewed the budget," Benjamin continued. "There was never any valid reason for this store to be so severely understaffed. Hiring will begin immediately. In the meantime, corporate is sending temporary support to help balance the workload." Rachel spoke up. "What about training? New hires don't last. They're thrown in without help and then they quit." "You're absolutely right," Benjamin replied. "Karen will implement a formal training process, and employees with experience will receive additional compensation if they take on mentoring roles." There were a few slow nods. Not trust. Not yet, but a sign that people were finally being heard. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken," Benjamin said with resolve. "It's about making sure this never happens again. Starting now, I will personally hold quarterly feedback sessions at every store. No more reports lost in middle management. You'll talk directly to me." Mia finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "And if someone like Greg shows up again, what happens then? What if we're ignored all over again?" Benjamin looked at her with unwavering conviction. "That won't happen. From now on, every store will have an anonymous reporting system connected directly to corporate leadership. If a manager abuses their power, if something is wrong, you report it, and it will be investigated." No one erupted in celebration, but something shifted, something quieter, something deeper. A sense, fragile, but real, that maybe, just maybe, things were truly going to change. Karen arrived shortly after. She was a no-nonsense woman in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. She got to work immediately, calling employees aside, listening closely, taking notes. Benjamin didn't fade into the background. He helped stock shelves, assisted at registers, and watched operations unfold with care. And what he saw was change. The fear that had once lingered like smoke was starting to clear. By midday, Mia walked up to him. She still moved with caution, but her expression had shifted. Her steps were lighter. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said softly, "for actually doing something." Benjamin gave a faint shake of his head. His voice carried the weight of regret. "I should have stepped in sooner. But I promise you, I'll never let this happen again." Mia gave a small nod. The panic that had once shadowed her eyes was no longer there. Then, without a word, she returned to her station. Benjamin remained still, his gaze following her. His chest felt heavy, yet beneath that weight stirred the first flicker of hope. This store had taken its first real step toward healing, but he knew the road ahead was still long, because this wasn't the only location in his company. 11 other stores waited, and this time he wouldn't be waiting behind a polished desk for filtered reports. He would go, himself, to each one, to see the truth with his own eye. He didn't leave after the first day. Benjamin stayed the entire week, quietly observing each shift in energy, each subtle change in the atmosphere. Every day he took notes, checked in with employees, and closely tracked how things evolved under Karen's leadership, the interim manager. Some improvements came almost immediately. The additional staff helped lift an enormous burden off the shoulders of those who had been stretched thin for far too long. The break room, once filled with heavy silence, now echoed with gentle conversations between shifts. Employees no longer rushed through tasks with frantic energy. They knew now that they had support, someone to carry the weight with them. But not every wound heals in a week. Some employees still held back, still paused before asking for help. You could see it in their eyes, the question that lingered: will I be ignored again? Years of mismanagement had left scars. Benjamin understood. No promise, no matter how sincere, could erase that kind of damage overnight. On the third day, he found Rachel in the stockroom during a quieter moment. She regarded him with a guarded expression, arms crossed tightly, like a shield. "You really want honest feedback?" she asked, voice edged with caution. Benjamin nodded. "I do." She sighed. "Things are better, I won't deny that. But there's still a lot of doubt. People are waiting to see if this sticks. We've had new managers come in, say all the right things, and then slip right back into the same mess once the pressure fades." She hesitated for a beat. "At least you staying longer than a day. It helps." Benjamin appreciated her honesty. "Then what would it take for you to believe this isn't temporary?" Rachel glanced toward the door, checking to make sure they were alone. Then she lowered her voice. "If you really want to fix this, give employees a way to speak up, without fear. Not a damn suggestion box. Real protection." Benjamin nodded slowly, absorbing her words with sincerity. That night, he began drafting a whistleblower protection policy, a formal process for investigating employee reports of misconduct, complete with clear procedures and consequences for retaliation. Because trust doesn't come from intention alone, it's built through systems that protect the people brave enough to speak out. By the end of the week, the store had started to feel like a different place. On the final evening, Benjamin stood near the front registers, quietly watching the closing shift. Mia moved with calm confidence as she processed each transaction. No more hesitation, no more second-guessing. Louis helped a customer find a product, his posture relaxed, no longer burdened by tension. Rachel stood beside a new hire, guiding them patiently, no longer leaving them to sink or swim on their own. Erin stepped beside Benjamin, arms relaxed at her sides. "It's stabilizing," she said softly. Benjamin nodded. "It is, but now I have to make sure this happens at every store." Karen tilted her head, studying him with sharp eyes. "You planning to go undercover again?" He considered the question for a moment. "Not in the same way, but I'm done managing from a distance. I need to see things, really see them, regularly." She gave a knowing nod. "If you do that, it'll make a real difference." Benjamin looked around the store. This place that just days ago had been drowning in chaos. Now, slowly, it was coming back to life. And in that moment, he understood something with perfect clarity. Leadership isn't about policies on paper. It isn't about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about people, the ones who keep everything moving. And from now on, he wouldn't assume things were working. He would make sure of it, with his presence and with his promise. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Moments of Quiet Truth, where we believe that the human spirit is never truly defeated, only waiting to rise.